Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with Matt. Glad you're here. Early September, Labor Day weekend. So looking forward to a nice long weekend. For most of you, we're going to be here all weekend. We're open Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And wonderful, wonderful planting weather happening right now. That oppressive tropic humidity level weather pattern that we had last week and the week before has finally broken. The humidity levels have come way crashing down, so it's a lot more pleasant to be outside. So fall is, as I've mentioned many times before, is probably my favorite time of year for planting. Most plants take exceptionally well to being planted at this time of year, and so we're really looking forward to a nice fall planting season. Today, my topic is exciting evergreens, and we could have, we could have titled this talk many different things. But really, what I wanted to do is highlight that there's a lot of other plants out there besides the old-fashioned yew bushes that my parents, my grandparents, everybody had in front of their homes. At least here in the Midwest, if your home was built or landscaped in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, there's a very high probability that the front foundation had yew bushes, or maybe what used to be called fitzers, which are really just junipers, planted all along the front. And so for a long time, I started in the industry in the early 90s. And for, I would say, most of the 90s and certainly well through the 2000s, whenever I would try to suggest an evergreen to a customer, I would get a lot of pushback because everybody had sort of this, not to make light of it, but sort of this PTSD from, growing up with all these yew bushes that constantly had to be pruned and cut back off the sidewalk and just enveloped the entire planting bed, that type of thing. So we weren't using a lot of them. They kind of fell out of favor for a long time, but there are a lot of really great evergreen plants. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about mostly smaller evergreens, but I do have a couple of large or full-size plants as well. So a lot of dwarf evergreens, but some really unique plants with beautiful texture, beautiful color, good disease resistance, good hardiness, all that good stuff. So kind of excited about that. If you were with me when I did the two-part series at my house where I walked around the yard, you may remember that I have a lot of what I call specimen evergreens like these. And some of these can be used in mass, some of them can be used as a specimen, but I had a lot of these, just kind of tucked in here and there in the midst of a perennial garden or in a shrub border or in the front foundation of the home, just as a small individual specimen. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of these, and I think you're really going to like this because there's some really neat plants to talk about. This is today will be no means an exhaustive list. I think I brought up a dozen or so different plants to talk about, but they're especially when you get into the world of dwarf conifers, dwarf evergreens. There are just literally hundreds of different varieties. Some of them, the differences are very slight, and from the kind of the more traditional version, like a yew, for instance. I did bring up a yew. I'm going to talk about it a little later. I mentioned we talk about those big, pillowy, overgrown yew bushes that everybody had, but there's a really cool variety that maybe still has a place in the home landscape. So I'll talk about that. Mugo pine. That's another one where we have. Those kind of fell out of favor because they were very large, overgrown plants, and now we have some nice, small, kind of dwarf specimens to choose from. So lots of fun stuff to talk about. I'll talk a little bit about a few of the disease issues that are going around on some of our larger evergreens as well. I didn't bring up some of those plants to talk about, but I am going to address some of those because I do get a lot of questions about it. So I thought since we're talking about evergreens, it would be a fitting time to discuss that. So without any further ado, let's just jump in here. One quick, not caveat, but it is Labor Day weekend. We have a really nice sale going on here at the Garden Center. Certainly my talks are designed to be educational and informative, not necessarily a sales talk, but just about every plant in the garden center is on sale, including all of our evergreens this weekend. So they are all 25% off. So everything that I'm talking about up here is in stock today and on sale. Although some things there's only 2 or 3 of, something there might be 8 or 10 or 12 of. So just wanted to throw that out there so you know. Okay, let's start talking. I guess let's start talking first about the false cypress family, because I brought up a few different ones. So false cypresses. So we can't grow true cypresses, the actual cupressus family. We can't grow those here in northern Illinois. So true cypresses like the Italian cypress and things like that, those do not grow here. But there is a group of plants called false cypress or Chamaecyparis. So the Chamaecyparis family, most of them will do well here, but not all. I have had, I think this year, probably 8 or 10 customers who bought a false cypress called Lawson's false cypress, or a variety of Lawson's. So that's Chamaecyparis lawsoniana. Bought those from a local box store here in the northern Illinois area. So they're selling Chamaecyparis, the Lawson's variety. Lawson's doesn't grow here. You will lose it 2 out of every 5 winters. You might get lucky and have it make a mild winter, but even this last winter, which was, by all intents and purposes, I would consider it a pretty mild winter. They had significant winter damage, dead to the snow line. Most years they'll be dead to the ground. You won't have anything. So the ones that we carry are hardy here. But like I said, not all false cypresses are hardy in northern Illinois. This is one of my favorites right here. This is called, you'll hear it called Boulevard. You'll hear it called a saguaro cypress, but it is a saguaro cypress. That's the kind of group that it falls into. This particular one is called Baby Blue. So it has this really nice, soft, it's actually green with white all over the needles, which gives it a very blue appearance. It is not prickly. It's not overly stiff either. This particular plant, the Baby Blue saguaro cypress, it grows pretty slowly in our area. I would say about 2 to 3 inches a year, so not very fast. As you can see here, this one is relatively rounded. It doesn't stay rounded though. If you trim it rounded, that's fine. If you just put it in the ground and never ever trim it, it's going to end up being shaped like a loose, soft gumdrop. So just slightly pyramidal, not pointy though like a Christmas tree, sort of rounded or a little softer at the top. So, I kind of call that like a gumdrop shape. It's a beautiful accent plant. It would do really well in an east or south facing or west facing foundation planting. It is just slightly sensitive to wind burn. So, not the type of plant that you would want to put like out in the, edge of the backyard, or, if you back up to a cornfield or an open field and you have tons of wind, probably not the best plant. Because it has that soft needle, they can dry out a little bit in the wintertime. So I like to put it up near the house. Most false cypresses are pretty drought tolerant, so they can be a little sensitive to being overwatered. So those would be the only things you really want to watch out for, is like a super, super windy spot or an overly wet spot, maybe a spot where the downspout is dumping into it, or just an area that tends to hold water, something like that. So I'd probably try to avoid those. Maximum size in our area is going to be 4 to 6 feet high. So not a particularly huge plant, but really nice in just about any garden. So that's Baby Blue saguaro cypress. So I brought up another saguaro cypress here. This one actually goes by the name of miniature moss cypress, and I don't know for sure, but I have this plant at home, but I may have talked about it on part 2 of my little garden tour at home. But this I have right near the front sidewalk to the home. So the sidewalk comes off the driveway. There's a little planter and a pedestal right there, and right next to that, right at the base of that planter, more or less right off the sidewalk, I have a miniature moss cypress. I actually got it as a sample. This particular one is grown by Monrovia Nursery out on the west coast. They have locations in Monrovia, California, and Visalia, California, as well as in Oregon. And so this is grown in Oregon, and then we bring them in every year. So this particular one, though, or the one that I have at home, I got as a sample from my friend at Monrovia, and it has performed exceptionally well. I have been blown away at how hardy this little plant is. The very first winter I planted it was a polar vortex winter, and I was really concerned. We didn't have a lot of snow cover. It was a new plant, planted in September of that year, and then, you know, fast forward a couple months and we've got, you know, 20, 30 below temperatures, whatever, and this plant made it through that winter like a champ. It didn't even have a dead branch in it. Subsequent winters, we've had heavy wet snow. We've had, it gets buried in snow every year because it's near the sidewalk, and I have to pile snow on top of it, or it just, you know, that's just the way it happens, the snow blower or the shovel. And anyway, it has done exceptionally well. It has actually grown a little faster than I thought it would. It is considered a slow-growing evergreen. I would say mine has grown about 3 to 4 inches a year, maybe 2 to 3 inches a year, something like that. So it's actually filled out quite nicely. The overall size of this plant is about 24 inches tall and about 24 to 30 inches wide. So it's kind of a sort of a pillowy, moundy type plant. But I would say this would look great near a rock garden. It's certainly a wonderful little specimen plant by itself. Good in the front of a bed, in front of other larger shrubs, that type of thing. Right behind this, I have some knockout roses, double knockout roses. And then behind that, I have a very large, full-sized maiden grass. So kind of have this nice little step down. So we've got this big, tall, wispy texture of the maiden grass. Then I have this punch of color with the double knockout roses, and then the little saguaro miniature moss cypress there in the front, just giving it some year-round interest and that little evergreen texture. So that's a really nice one, miniature moss cypress. We also have a variegated variety of this. There was, I don't know, 3 or 4 of those left that looked really nice. And so it's an interesting variegation on it. It's the exact same plant, but just all throughout the plant here and there are like a whitish yellow leaf, basically just whitish yellow coloration. But it's not, unlike most variegated plants, it's not every leaf in the whole entire plant. It's just kind of all throughout, just randomly. So it's really a unique plant, and that's just called variegated moss cypress. So really another neat Chamaecyparis. And then this is actually one of my favorite false cypresses. So there's a group of false cypresses called hinoki false cypress. We have a pretty old hinoki cypress planted actually at the very north end of our office building here at the garden center. And that tree was planted in, let's say, probably like 05 time frame, give or take a year or two. So it's been there a long time. It is truly north facing. It gets blasted by the winter winds. In fact, it's sort of off the northwest corner of the building, so it gets blasted by winds. It's completely exposed, and it has done exceptionally well for us. As I mentioned before, and with most false cypresses, they like a well-drained soil, or at least don't like to sit in water. So I would say that's probably the biggest key to getting a false cypress to take, is to make sure that it doesn't get overwatered. This is a true dwarf hinoki cypress. So you'll find all sorts of, there are many hinoki cypresses, and many of them are labeled or listed as dwarf hinoki cypress. This one has a name. Its name is Coster or Costeri. And so Coster's dwarf hinoki cypress is, I would say, one of the most dwarf of all the dwarf hinoki cypresses. The thing that I love about this is that it really has no true shape. So again, its overall shape is sort of gumdrop shaped again, so not truly pointy like some of the hinoki cypresses are. But all of the branches get this little curve and swoop, and you know, they come out at different angles, so it just gives it a really neat, soft texture. And the other thing I like about it is that the new growth out here on the tips tends to be very limey green or bright green, and then inside more tends to be darker green. I'm not sure how well that shows up on this camera, but in real life, there's definitely a two-tone appearance between the tips and then what's further back inside. So it's got that really unique texture where all the branches come out in different ways and swoops and curves and almost little like cupped branching. This is, it is considered an upright, but again, sort of like a moundy or gumdrop shape to it. I would say that the growth rate on this is going to be around 2 to 3 inches a year in our area. And maximum size is going to be somewhere in the 3-foot range. It would take a long time for this plant to get much bigger than that in our area. I suppose I should mention, since I keep saying our area and talk about growth rate in our area, it's really important to know with really all of these plants that I'm talking about, but more specifically, or I guess more generally, plants in general. When you look online, if you look up some of these plants, the Coster cypress or the baby blue saguaro that I just had up here a minute ago, if you look those up online, you may find that some resources, whether it be universities or botanic gardens or other growers and garden centers or just homeowners, they may have a baby blue false cypress that, and they may list it as an 8 to 10 foot tall plant, or they may list it as moderate growth rate, or their growth rates might be listed as twice as fast as what I've been mentioning. It's important to note that in Illinois, we have a much shorter growing season than they do, say, in a coastal climate. So most of these plants are not going to grow in the south. It gets way too hot in the summer and not cold enough in the winter. So you're not going to see really any of these that we've been talking about in the southern part of the U.S. So then if we go to the northern half of the U.S., we have basically two categories, if you will. We've got basically the Midwest or upper Midwest, and then we've got the coastal climate on either coast, Northwest and Northeast. The Northwest coast is like conifer. Conifers, just to clarify, conifer is a cone-bearing plant, like spruces and pines and things like that. They produce a cone, so they're considered conifers. So we tend to use the term conifer and evergreen interchangeably. It's not always true. Not every cone-bearing plant is necessarily an evergreen, but the Pacific Northwest is like conifer heaven. They have the absolute perfect growing conditions for all of these plants. So you go out there and you will just see some of the most magnificent specimens in Portland and Vancouver and Seattle and that whole area up there. Just absolutely gorgeous specimens of these types of plants. But their growing season is like 10 months long. It really is. Their season starts so much earlier. There's just a very short dormant period, and then the season starts over again. So they have a much, much longer growing season than we do here in the upper Midwest. So their plants are going to get much larger. They're going to get there faster. Generally, when I'm talking about plant sizes, I like to use reasonable amounts of time, right? A tulip tree, for instance, in our area may max out around 30 or 40, maybe 50 feet tall. But if I look up tulip tree online, or if I go to North Carolina, they have tulip trees that are over 200 feet tall. You've got two totally different scenarios. One is a 300-year-old tree and is grown in its natural native environment in a completely undisturbed location. And one is in a subdivision in northern Illinois. Two totally different growing environments. The soil is different, the weather is different, the length of season is different. So when I'm talking about sizes, I tend to talk about the upper Midwest, and I tend to talk about like a 10 to 12 year size or 10 to 20 year size. If it's a tree, I tend to go more towards like what is it going to look like after 20 years. If it's smaller specimens, shrubs, evergreens, things like that, I'm generally talking about a 10 or 12 year time span, that type of thing, because that's a reasonable amount of time. We're not talking what it's going to look like 50 years from now. So I hope that helps and clears up a few of those things. One more, nope, I think that's it for the false cypresses. Although I did bring up this little one here. This is another little dwarf hinoki called Butterball, which is very small with green and yellow. But the reason I brought these up, I've got a couple of these little pots here. We have a whole collection of these kind of plants which are great for fairy gardens, railroad gardens, miniature gardens, rock gardens, ponds and waterfalls, as well as for bonsai. These are, basically considered like pre-bonsai. So this is a little dwarf hemlock right here. This one's called Moonfrost. It gets these really cool white tips on the new growth. The little Butterball false cypress with its bright yellow. And then this is a little dwarf Arborvitae called Primo. But all of these would be great as a pre-bonsai. So you could, if you're working with bonsai, you could turn any of these into a neat little tree. But if you have a railroad or fairy garden or miniature garden of some kind, these would work great too. These are also just great just to shove like between rocks in a rock garden or near a waterfall. Plant it in there, let it go, and it'll just kind of take whatever shape it can. So we have a whole collection of little plants like this. I'm not really going to talk about those individually, but kind of a neat thing. So, all right, let's move on from false cypress. Got a new mug today. This was brought back. One of my guys was on vacation. He lives in Oaxaca, Mexico. Brought me a cool mug, so thanks Geronimo for that. And Kinpo Japanese white pine. One of my favorite groups of plants are the Japanese white pine. If you remember from my videos at home, I have several different Japanese white pines at home. I actually do not have Kinpo. I'm not sure why, because it's one of my favorites. Kinpo is a very, very dwarf Japanese white pine. It's slightly pyramidal in shape, so I would consider it an upright. Very slow growing, 2 to 3 inches a year. It's another one of those that has a bicolor needle. So the one side of the needle is green, the other side is like bluish white. So it gives it this two-tone appearance. The needles typically twist and curve a little bit, which just kind of gives it a unique texture. It is very hardy. It's hardy to about 25 to 30 below zero. So Japanese white pine tend to do very well here. And then this little one, again, very, very small, 2 to 3 feet tall at max. This would be great near the front of the house. A lot of times people on either side of the front door underneath the coach light like to plant things like pyramidal Arborvitae, dwarf Alberta spruce, upright boxwood, all of those kind of things. All of those want to get 6 feet or better. And so they look great when they're first planted, and then a few years later, they're way too tall for that location. This might be a nice one, especially if you want something a little more unique, less traditional, on either side of the front door. This would be really neat. Another just beautiful specimen plant. At my home, my Japanese white pines are just sort of plugged into the landscape. So in the backyard, underneath a tricolor beech, near some bee balm, I have a little dwarf Japanese white pine called Snow in the Valley, and it's got green and white tips, and it's just right in the midst of a bunch of perennials. There's some hostas nearby, and it just looks great there. In the front yard, I have one called Goldilocks, which is a green and yellow variegated variety, and it's just kind of right at the front edge of a bed, right behind my wild swan anemones. It looks great year-round. It's very welcoming. It's right by the front entry. And it's there permanently. So, this winter when everything was buried in snow, it just stuck out of the snow like a nice little specimen there. So that's kind of neat. So this is Kinpo Japanese white pine. You're pretty hard pressed to find a Japanese white pine that I don't like. And again, they're very delicate looking plants, but they are a lot tougher than most people give them credit for. I brought up a couple of little Norway spruces. So this is probably the time that I'll talk about some of the diseases that are going around on some of our larger trees. So these are both Norway spruce that I brought up here. Norway spruce, the regular variety of Norway spruce, which is called Picea abies. So Norway spruce, this is another one of those where if you look online or you look at some really old Norway spruce, you may find a Norway spruce that's 75 feet tall. That is not out of the question at all, maybe even 100 feet tall. But that's also a very, very old plant. I have a regular Norway spruce at home that I'm quite sure were planted when the home was built, or right around that time, which was 1988. So somewhere around 88 or 90, I believe that these Norway spruce were planted. They're in the backyard. They kind of frame the backyard. You may have seen them in some of the videos or pictures that I've posted. They're about 30 feet tall, and I would say for the most part 12 to the biggest one's probably 18 feet wide at the base after 30 years. So that is actually a good estimation of how big that plant is going to get. However, just right around the corner here at the Andersons farm, so the Andersons have been in the Campton Hills area here for, I think, gosh, probably 100 years, maybe even, I guess, more than that. So right on Brown Road, if you're near the Brown Road baseball fields and Anderson Park, which is, part of that land was donated by the Anderson family, there's a row of Norway spruce along Brown Road that are probably 100 years old, and they're probably 75 feet tall. They're massive trees. They're very hardy. They're very long-lived, and they're very disease resistant. I love Norway spruce. I love Norway spruce for replacing some of the less hardy or more disease-prone trees in our area. So right now there's 3 that make the top of the list for do not plant in northern Illinois. Colorado spruce, which is Picea pungens. They also are commonly called blue spruce. So there really is no such thing as blue spruce. There's blue varieties of Colorado spruce. So it's really a Colorado blue spruce. So the Colorado spruce has 2 disease problems, 2 main disease problems that are going around. And unfortunately, because the tree was so widely planted in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was so widely planted in this area that, used to be all farm fields and was wide open. And everybody wanted windbreaks, and they wanted privacy screens, and they wanted, Christmas trees that they could put lights on and all that kind of stuff. So Colorado spruce were very widely planted around here during that time frame. Unfortunately, Colorado spruce, as the name suggests, are native to the mountain states. They are native to high, dry locations. So they're growing up at elevation and very well drained, very rocky soils. Unfortunately, we don't have those same growing conditions here. For some reason, the Colorado spruce did exceptionally well for all of those years. However, with our hot, humid summers, which they don't have in Colorado, and with our heavy rain or wet, poorly drained soil, that clay that retains water, I believe it is kind of a combination of those factors allowed 2 particular diseases, but to spread. One is called Rhizosphaera needlecast. Rhizosphaera needlecast is characterized typically by the lower branches dying off. So what you're going to see is needles just falling off the lower branches. Sometimes it's kind of all the way around. A lot of times you'll see it on the shadier side of the tree first, and then it works its way around to the sunny side of the tree. But it usually starts at the bottom. It usually just starts randomly, so a branch here and there just starts dropping its needles. So you have, a nice healthy branch here, and then this branch has no needles on it, or vice versa. And then it slowly starts working its way upward, just killing the tree off limb by limb. Branches that are infected with Rhizosphaera needlecast do not come back. So once that branch has been infected and dropped all of its needles, it does not grow back at all. And it just starts working its way up the tree. There are some chemical sprays. There are some fungicides that work quite well. One is called Infuse. That's the one that we carry here. Infuse is a systemic fungicide. It can be applied to the tree when the needle, or what's called the bud cap, when the bud cap is falling off. So that's the new growth. You can't really see it on these guys right here, but on the bud in the springtime when the bud is swelling, there's a little cone-shaped kind of waxy coating on the leaf bud. And that is usually kind of an orangey or peachy color. And as the needles start to grow, as that bud starts to swell, that cap, which again we call a bud cap, that cap falls off, exposing the brand new growth of the tree. That would be the time that you would start spraying, and you spray it. You make 3 applications, once right around when the bud caps fall off, once about 10 to 14 days later, and another time 10 to 14 days later. So you're making 3 applications. That is not going to cure it, though. It's only going to protect the new growth that's coming out from getting infected. So if you catch it early or you start spraying proactively, you'll be in really good shape. If you have a tree that's 30, 50% gone, something like that, the hopes of that tree, being treatable, probably not real high. So that's rhizosphere and needlecast. The other one that we're seeing on them, Colorado spruce specifically, is called Cytospora canker. And that generally starts at the top of the tree and then works its way down. Cytospora canker is, canker diseases typically affect the trunk or bark of a plant. And it's, for lack of a better term, it's almost like a cancer. It's this growth that happens inside, and what it does is it prevents water and nutrients from being delivered from the root system up past that point. So wherever that canker forms, the veins of the plant, which should be delivering water and nutrients up to the top of the plant, they get clogged up, blocked by this canker, this cancerous type growth, and then everything after that canker dies. So a lot of times you'll just see the top of a tree, 6, 8, 10, 12 feet, just dies. That's Cytospora canker. Sometimes you'll see it just on a specific branch, way up high in the tree, and this whole big main branch will die. That is most likely Cytospora canker. So 2 diseases on the Colorado spruce, making that, in my opinion, a no-no for planting around here. I do still see landscapers planting them. I still see some garden centers selling them. Just something to be cautious about if you're planting an evergreen planting in your own yard. The other 2 that I would steer clear of are the Austrian pine and Scotch pine. Austrian pine and Scotch pine, again, were very widely planted in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. By the 90s, we were already starting to have some issues with them. Late 90s, early 2000s, we quit growing them completely. They have a disease called, or an insect rather, called Zimmerman pine moth. The Zimmerman pine moth is actually sort of not a true moth like you think of like butterflies. It's more of a, almost a sort of a wasp-like insect, but lands on the bark, lays eggs. The eggs hatch into a little larva that burrows into the tree and kind of eats the tree from the inside out, sort of feeding underneath the bark and whatnot. So that's Zimmerman pine moth. And they also can get another disease, which is called diplodia. It's a tip blight, so it's a fungal disease that affects the new growth of the plants. A lot of times it's kind of one of those chicken or the egg, which comes first type scenarios. Most often I actually see both of them in the plant. I don't know which one it got, but one of them weakened the plant, which made it more susceptible to getting the other. And it doesn't really matter which came first, but we don't recommend planting Austrian pine or Scotch pine, which is why I wanted to talk about some of these other varieties in here. There are some treatments if you have a healthy Austrian pine. There are some treatment options for Zimmerman pine moth and for diplodia tip blight. So I would say on those, maybe stop in, ask me, but there's a systemic insecticide capsule that can be drilled into the trunk of the tree and inserted to deliver an insecticide throughout. That's called ACE cap. That's probably the most effective home remedy, if you will, for or do-it-yourself remedy for Zimmerman pine moth. And then diplodia needs to be sprayed infused with that same systemic fungicide when the new growth is first coming out. So alternatively, plant some of these other varieties and you won't have those issues. The good thing about most plant diseases is that they're host specific. So host specific means that a disease that attacks, say, Canadian hemlock or an insect that attacks Canadian hemlock isn't going to attack, say, a Norway spruce. Now that's not a blanket statement. I'm just saying that most of them are, which is good. So it means that if you have rhizosphere and needlecast at home and you plant, say, a green giant arborvitae or a white pine, those are resistant or immune, I should say, to rhizosphere and needlecast. So you're not going to have that problem again. But if you take a Colorado spruce that had rhizosphere and needlecast and you take that one out and plant another one back in there, it is highly likely that you're going to get that infection again. So that's just a little bit about what's going on with the evergreens around town. You've probably seen this, or now that I've mentioned it and you drive around and you say, that's what Matt was talking about. So I brought up 2 Norway spruces that I like here. This is the tiniest of them. This is called Little Gem. Little Gem is dwarf in every kind of fashion, so the needles are tiny. A normal Norway spruce needle is, I would say, close to 1 inch long. The Norway spruce, this Little Gem here, I would say that's, I don't know, a 1/4 of an inch. So the needles are short, the new growth is short, so it just gives it this tiny little almost pincushion-like appearance. I would say full size is going to be like maybe 2 feet across and a foot, 1.5 feet tall. So very small, very slow growing, tough as nails. Norway spruce are one of the hardiest. They are hardy to about 40 below zero, which makes them very, very hardy for our area and very tolerant of like exposure. So out away from the house, any of the Norway spruce will do just fine. This is another one here called Tampa. So Tampa Norway spruce is this nice little slightly globose plant with just a little taper at the top. So it's not really Christmas tree shaped like the regular Norway spruce. It's not flat like some of the like bird's nest type spruce. Those are also Norway spruce. But Tampa's kind of a round or almost gumdrop shape. It grows about 2 to 3 inches a year. I would say max size on this is going to be about 3, maybe 4 feet tall in time, but it would take a long time for a Tampa Norway spruce to get 4 feet tall. But great little specimen. Another one that's going to be great on either side of the front door. Great out at the corner of the house if you want a little specimen evergreen, but also great just mixed in a perennial or shrub bed, kind of a mixed bed. All right, keep moving along here. Okay, so this is called Emerald Spreader Yew. So this is not your grandmother's yew. This particular one only gets around a foot tall, maybe 1.5 feet in time. It can get as wide as about 8 feet. That would take quite some time as well. I would say the landscape size, a good kind of landscape size to think about for around here, would be about 8 to 12 inches tall and about 3 feet wide. It's basically a ground cover, but what I wanted to show is the way that this grows. You can kind of see this branch right here. It almost cantilevers out, and it's nice and sturdy. It's not dropping and weeping at all, and so it gives it this sort of really unique, almost like fireworks. You know, they kind of shoot out sort of texture to it. And so if you have like a rock garden, a retaining wall, a waterfall or pond, this is going to look really cool because these branches are going to cantilever out over the water or out over the rocks or over your wall. The needles are much shorter than most yews, so it kind of gives it a unique texture. The new growth is very limey green, and the older growth is darker green, so you still have that sort of two-tone thing going on. Word of caution, deer like to eat yew bushes of all kinds, so you're going to want to, if you have deer issues, you're probably going to want to stay away from all of the yews, including this one. Yew bushes are toxic, so just again a word of caution. I mean, you know, again, we've had yew bushes in our foundation plantings for, you know, many years without issue. You know, if you're not in there eating them, you're going to be perfectly fine. It's not toxic to the touch or anything. Cool little factoid. The yew plant, actually the American yew, which is called Taxus baccata, that particular plant, they've actually extracted the toxic element, which is called a taxine, So Taxus is the yew family, and taxine, they've developed a chemotherapy drug that's very effective against certain types of cancer called Taxol. And Taxol is extracted from the taxine in the yew plant. So kind of cool thing there. But that's emerald spreader yew, full sun to full shade, which is kind of neat as well. All right, this is not actually all that exciting of a plant, but I did want to bring it up because I do get questioned a lot about boxwood. This is a boxwood called Chicagoland green. As the name suggests, it is very hardy in the Chicago area. I only bring it up here because I get a lot of people who are a little gun shy about boxwood because a few years ago in the polar vortex, they had a lot of boxwood loss on their landscape or around town, or they've just had boxwood loss in a past winter. This is another one of those where there are a lot of different varieties of boxwood out there, many of them being sold at the box stores that are just not hardy in northern Illinois at all. And so when you take those and you have a couple of mild or even just average winters, they do fine. And then we get a harsh Chicago winter, which obviously happens, and the plant is half brown or completely dead, whatever the case may be. I do have a video out on our YouTube channel about the difference between like boxwood blight, which is something that's affecting boxwood out on the East Coast, and winter kill and winter damage, because those are two totally different things. But the Chicagoland boxwood made it through that polar vortex winter like a champ. We did not have winter kill or winter burn issues on Chicagoland boxwood. In fact, I have 4 of them planted at the northeast corner of our office building, out away from the building, completely exposed to the elements. They're not right next to the building or anything. They're out away from the building, about 8 or 10 or 12 feet at least. And they were planted in 97. So they have been there for over 20 years and are doing exceptionally well. And they're now in full shade. They were planted in partial sun. Now the trees have filled out. This is a boxwood that can grow in full sun or full shade and is actually winter hardy. So that's Chicagoland green. The other 2 boxwood that I like, I didn't bring them up here, but the other 2 that I like for our area are Green Velvet and Green Mountain. Those are the ones I would plant in my own yard. Aside from that, I wouldn't recommend boxwood plantings in northern Illinois. Okay, earlier I mentioned Fitzers or junipers. As a point of personal preference, I'm not a juniper fan. However, I really like this particular juniper. This is called Blue Star, and I probably like it because it doesn't look like any of the other junipers. So this one has a very bright blue appearance. It's probably certainly the most blue of any of the evergreens I brought up here, and I can't think of anything that's more truly blue than than this one here. So Blue Star juniper is not a spreading juniper, and it's not an upright juniper. So those are usually the 2 classifications. It's kind of an in-betweener. It's moundy. It definitely tends to be wider than it is tall, but it does not spread and creep along the ground. It just sort of does its own thing. So sort of kind of pillowy type texture. It's not real prickly. It's a little prickly, but not that bad. I can rub my hand across here. That doesn't hurt. You can do this. That doesn't hurt at all. If you really stick your hand deep inside the plant, it's probably going to be slightly prickly. Blue Star juniper is another one that is very, very sensitive to being overwatered. The only time I see issues with Blue Star juniper, it's not winter issues. It's always root rot issues associated with too much water. So keep them on the dry side or plant them in a well-drained location. Because they have that bright blue color, they would like full sun. Max size, 2 to 3 feet wide by about 10 to 18 inches tall, I would say. So that's Blue Star juniper. Interestingly enough, we also can do Blue Star juniper on a single trunk. And I don't know if I'll just hold this one here for a minute. So this is a grafted tree. So it's a juniper, and the trunk here is going to be some upright juniper, probably something like just a regular Chinese juniper. So they grow a single trunked juniper and then they graft the blue star onto the top of it, giving it this nice little sort of topiary appearance. So kind of neat. It's got the juniper bark is very pretty with that kind of mottled red and gray bark, and then you've got the blue on the top. So it's not going to get a whole lot bigger than what you see in terms of height, but the top will get larger, so that sort of lollipop on top is going to get larger and will end up being, so you're going to have that 24-inch trunk or so, or 20-inch trunk, and then you're going to have this sort of moundy ball on top, which is kind of cool. So it's a nice little specimen there. That's a blue star juniper on a standard. So if you ever hear that term on a standard, that means it was grown or grafted onto a single trunk. All right, I brought up just a couple of hemlocks that I want to talk about, and then we're going to talk about one Arborvitae, and then we'll get on with our day. So, first one here, this is a hemlock called Golden Duchess. It's exclusively grown, patented by Monrovia Nursery, which I mentioned before. So this is grown out of their Oregon location, and it has this beautiful golden color to it. I really like Golden Duchess a lot. It's a dwarf hemlock. It's going to get about 6 feet tall and about 3 to 4 feet wide. Upright, it's Christmas tree shaped, but it's a very loose plant, so it's not going to be like really tight and formal, although hemlock trim very well. If you did want to trim it, you could trim this into a globe. You could grow it into a gumdrop shape. You could even top it and square it off. They trim actually very, very well. Not commonly trimmed, but they do very well with it. So that's Golden Duchess. So it's going to be bright golden yellow basically all year long. In fact, it gets more yellow during the winter time and a little less yellow during the summer, but it's still very yellow right now. So I really like that one a lot. I would say partial sun to mostly shade. I'd be a little concerned if this was like baking out in the full hot sun. That probably would be less than ideal for this plant. And then I know I talked about this plant, I think, on a video last year, but I love hemlocks. I do have this one at home. I have a lot of hemlocks at home. They're probably my favorite group of conifers, right up there at least with Japanese white pine. This particular hemlock, so these are all Canadian or Eastern hemlock is what they're called. There are Western hemlocks. Those don't grow here, so if you see Western hemlock in the name, you're going to want to avoid that. So this is an Eastern hemlock. This one's called Dawson's, and Dawson's hemlock is a very irregular plant. So where most hemlocks grow in a kind of traditional Christmas tree type shape, but are much looser, this has really no shape at all. It can get huge after a while. It is slow growing. It's very slow growing. In fact, mine is probably averaging 2 inches a year. But if you look up pictures of this and you find some of the old ones that are in arboretums, it's one of the most spectacular plants you'll ever see. In time, they can get quite large. I would say about 8 to 12 feet tall and maybe 20 feet wide eventually. They certainly can be pruned, and this is not going to be one of those plants where you're just going to wake up one day and say, oh my gosh, how did that plant get so large? Which happens to a lot of things where you're just like, oh, maybe I should trim that, and then the next year it's like 3 feet over your windows. This is not going to be that plant. This is going to be a plant that if you decided that a branch needed to be pruned or something, you would have years to decide whether or not you wanted to prune it or something. But really cool plant, basically full sun to full shade. I would recommend part sun, but hemlocks do very well in full sun, and they do very well in quite a bit of shade. I have a Dawson's underneath the canopy of a 30-year-old sweet gum tree. It's about, I'd say about 8 or 10 feet away from the tree trunk. So the canopy is shading it, but it does get a lot of indirect light and just a little bit of very late afternoon when the sun is low in the sky. a little bit of direct sunlight at that time of day. So that's Dawson's hemlock. I guess I will talk about two more plants that I brought up here because I mentioned Arborvitae earlier, and maybe I should just put this one down here so you can see a little bit better. So this is an Arborvitae here called Nordic Spire, and this was actually brought over by a local nurseryman, and he brought this over from Denmark. And this is a deer-resistant Arborvitae. So that's really important because all of the eastern Arborvitaes, the Techni and Pyramidal and Globe Arborvitae and Mission Arborvitae, and a lot of those are not deer-resistant. So at home, you've probably, again, heard me talk about this, the deer on some old eastern Arborvitae have trimmed them all the way up, and I can walk, it's like shoulder high. I just have to duck a little bit to get underneath them. And these are 30-foot tall Arborvitae that the deer have completely trimmed up from the bottom. This is deer resistant, and it has this very nice, loose, shaggy appearance. It gets very full at the bottom eventually. So I know you can see the top here in the video now. I'm just going to put this back up on the table so you can see the kind of the lower part. So that will end up getting very full at the bottom. Keeps this nice, loose texture, not quite weeping, but certainly not stiff. Moderate growth rate, it's going to get about 20 tall and 8 to 12 wide. So I really like Nordic Spire Arborvitae a lot. I think that's a neat tree. We just added it. We are growing these out in our field now. This is obviously a little smaller container grown plant, but we are growing those out in our fields now. We don't quite have them all the way up to the size that we would like them. But we think it's a great plant, so we've kind of added it to the nursery where we'll be growing it in larger numbers and trying to grow larger plants than this here, so you don't have to wait forever to have a nice big plant. So last plant of the day is another Arborvitae. This is another Monrovia introduction. This is called Tiny Tower. So Tiny Tower is a slower growing dwarf, not really a true dwarf. We'll just say a slower growing, smaller version of green giant Arborvitae. So I have green giant Arborvitae at home. They are deer resistant. That's why I planted them. I had to replace a very old, one of those 30-year-old eastern Arborvitae, broke in half and fell open in a Thanksgiving snowstorm a few years ago. I had to remove that plant, and so I filled that space in with green giant Arborvitae because the deer will not eat the bottoms off of them, and they have not. They're doing great. They're growing, honestly, 2 to 3 feet a year. They are incredibly fast growers. But they're going to get big. But where I planted them, they have room to get big. If you don't quite have the room, or you want something a little tighter and a little slower growing, but still want to have that look and the deer resistance of the western Arborvitae, like green giant, this is a great choice. So this is called Tiny Tower. It is a sport of green giant, so it was found in a group of green giants, and it just grows a little slower. It's a little more compact. It's going to be a little smaller overall. I would say around 12 to 18 feet tall eventually, by about 5 to 7 wide or so. Very much can be sheared, so definitely trimmable if you want to keep it a little narrower. But that's called Tiny Tower. I think that definitely has a place in the landscape here, because it will get a little taller than Pyramidal and Emerald Green and some of those, and it's deer resistant, but it's still very trimmable. I also like the fact, I like the look and texture of the Western Arborvitae, or that Nordic Spire that I showed you a couple minutes ago. I like the look and texture of that much more than I do the traditional Eastern Arborvitae, like the ones that I mentioned that the deer have eaten at my home. They're there at my house, so I'm going to leave them, but if I was planting, I would not have planted those. I like the texture of these much better. So yeah, that was kind of a quick run through on some neat varieties. Of course, there's a lot more information to share about these plants. If you have questions about the plants, as usual, you can comment. Many of you probably already are. Megan's been answering questions today, so thank you to her. So she's great at answering all those questions for you. But, if some of these particular plants appeal to you and you've got more specific questions, or, is this going to work in my site, that type of thing, feel free to stop in or email us or give us a call. We'll be happy to try to answer those questions for you as best we can. I'm pretty sure, I've got to confirm the date and time and everything, but I think next Saturday I will have a talk on pruning. It's a oft requested talk, and what I'm going to do, I think, is do it Facebook Live. So we'll do it just like this traditional, or traditional now anyway, format for me. But I'm also going to have, I think, some people attend live. So be on the lookout for that. We'll post it onto Facebook. There will be like an Eventbrite registration for that. We will limit the number of people, both for just COVID and that kind of stuff, but also just if there's too many people attending, it's hard to hear. You get too many questions and it just can get a little difficult. So we will open that up to some in-person folks, and we'll do that, I think, out in the nursery. I just have to find the right plants that I can show you what I would like to in terms of teaching and training on pruning. So we're not going to be talking, this is not going to be a talk about pruning up high in trees and climbing and ropes and all that. That is, first of all, it's way beyond me. It's way beyond most homeowners. I leave that stuff to the professionals. What we're going to be talking about is pruning shrubs, limbing trees up, the kind of stuff that we all need to know about pruning in and around our own home and landscape. So we'll be talking about all that good stuff. So that's going to most likely be next Saturday, so be on the lookout for that. So again, thanks for being with me this morning for Coffee with Matt. I hope that it was informational and educational. As always, if you ever have any questions, just give us a call or stop in and we'll be happy to help. So hopefully we'll see some of you here this weekend to buy some of this cool evergreen stuff. Like I said, there's lots more out there than just the varieties I brought. So if you have questions about some of those other ones, or if there's one you had your eye on, feel free to ask those questions as well. So thanks again for watching, and hope you have a wonderful holiday weekend.